Pink and blue balloons swayed from the ceiling as he handed his pregnant wife the divorce papers. His mistress stood behind him, smirking like she'd won some grand prize. He'd rehearsed this moment during lunch breaks between conference calls about the $10.5 billion deal that would make him a legend, never once questioning why the mysterious company kept their CEO's identity so carefully hidden. His pregnant wife, wearing the flowered dress she'd chosen for what should have been a joyful celebration, held the papers with trembling hands. Each tear that fell was a testament to betrayal he was too blind to understand. The mistress laughed, sharp and cruel. Completely unaware the woman crying before them was the Trillionaire CEO who'd built a business empire from nothing. She owned the exact company his career depended on and had the power to turn their dreams to dust with a single phone call. Tomorrow morning, he would walk into the most important meeting of his life, confident and proud, completely unaware his pregnant wife would be sitting at the head of that conference table. Would he recognize her before destroying everything? Could his mistress's laughter survive when truth shattered their illusions? What price would they pay for humiliating the one person who held their fate in her hands? Backhand index pointing right. Keep watching to discover how this jaw-dropping story unfolds. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more powerful stories that teach valuable life lessons. The venue coordinator had outdone herself with the decorations. Pastel ribbons cascaded from crystal chandeliers. Centerpieces of white roses adorned each table, and a three-tier cake stood proudly displaying "Welcome Baby" in delicate fondant script. Victoria Hayes stood near the gift table, 7 months pregnant, her hand unconsciously resting on her belly as she watched guests mingle and laugh. She was completely unaware her entire world was about to shatter in front of everyone she knew. Her husband, James Hayes, had texted an hour ago saying he'd be late due to an important work call. She'd smiled and told herself his career demanded sacrifices. The $10.5 billion deal he'd been obsessing over for 6 months deserved his attention, even on this special day. What Victoria hadn't expected was for him to arrive with Natasha Wright, his executive assistant who'd started at his firm 8 months ago. There she was, clinging to his arm like she belonged, wearing a red dress that screamed confidence and a smile that whispered secrets Victoria had been too trusting to see. "Everyone, can I have your attention, please?" James's voice cut through the cheerful conversations. The room fell silent with that expectant hush that usually preceded speeches about love and family. Victoria's sister, Rebecca, stood near the dessert table with her phone half raised to capture what she assumed would be a touching moment. But the expression on James's face wasn't warm affection. It was the cold determination of a man who'd made a decision and refused to question it. "I have an announcement to make," James continued, reaching into his jacket pocket while Natasha's hand squeezed his arm encouragingly, her perfectly manicured nails glinting under the soft lighting. Victoria felt her heart begin to race. Something primal in her intuition screamed danger even before her conscious mind could process what was happening. Her baby kicked inside her, as if sensing the tension building in the room. James pulled out a manila envelope, handling it like just another business document rather than a bomb about to destroy lives. Victoria's stomach twisted with nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy. "Victoria, I think we both know our marriage hasn't been working for a while now," he said, his tone professional and detached, the same voice he probably used when firing underperforming employees. "You've been focused on your little hobbies and staying home, but I need someone who understands ambition, someone who can match my success, someone who actually contributes to my life rather than just existing in it." The words landed like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to cut deeper than the last. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people realized what they were witnessing. Victoria's mother moved toward her, but Victoria held up a hand to stop her. Some core of strength refused to let her collapse in front of this audience, even though her legs trembled and her vision blurred with tears. "These are divorce papers," James continued, walking toward her with Natasha following 2 steps behind, that smirk still playing on her lips like she was watching her favorite show reach its climactic moment. "I've already had my lawyers draft everything. You'll be taken care of financially. I'm not a monster, but I need to move forward with my life. Tomorrow's meeting with Apex Global Industries will launch me into a stratosphere you could never reach." He handed her the envelope, and when their fingers touched briefly, Victoria searched his eyes for any hint of the man she'd married 5 years ago, the man who'd promised to love her in sickness and health, for richer or poorer. But all she saw was a stranger wearing her husband's face. The room had gone completely silent now, the kind of silence that feels heavy and suffocating, where even breathing seems too loud. Victoria could feel dozens of eyes watching her, waiting to see if she would break down, scream, beg, or simply crumble under the weight of this public humiliation. But what none of them knew, what James had never bothered to discover because he'd been too busy chasing deals and promotions and mistresses who fed his ego, was that Victoria Hayes was also Victoria Chun, the founder and CEO of Apex Global Industries, the very company about to sign the $10.5 billion deal that James believed would make his career. She'd built her empire quietly over the past 7 years, keeping her maiden name for business and her married name for personal life. She wanted to know if James loved her for herself rather than her wealth, wanted to build something separate from their relationship that belonged entirely to her. The tears streaming down her face now were real, grief for a marriage that had clearly died long before this moment, pain for betrayal by someone she trusted completely, humiliation from being discarded like garbage in front of friends and family. But behind those tears, her mind was already calculating, already planning, already seeing moves on a chessboard James didn't even know he was playing on. Victoria's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, the crisp legal papers rustling in the silence that had consumed the baby shower venue like a suffocating blanket. Natasha stepped closer to James, her laugh breaking through the tension, sharp and cruel, designed to assert dominance over a woman she believed had already lost everything worth having. "Oh, honey, don't cry too much," Natasha said, her voice dripping with false sympathy that fooled absolutely no one in the room. "James needs a woman who understands the corporate world. Someone who can stand beside him when he signs the biggest deal in the industry tomorrow. Not someone whose greatest accomplishment is picking out nursery colors." The insult hung in the air, and Victoria saw her sister Rebecca's face flush with anger, saw her mother's hands clench into fists, saw friends she'd known for years looking at James with disgust and confusion. But she also saw something else. She saw exactly who these people truly were when they thought they held all the power. James cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the attention now that the dramatic moment had passed, his confidence wavering slightly under the weight of so many judgmental stares fixed on him and his mistress. "Look, Victoria, this doesn't have to be ugly," he said, his tone shifting to something approximating reasonableness, though the damage was already done and everyone in that room knew it. "You'll get the house in the suburbs, a fair settlement, and you can focus on being a mother, which is really what you're good at anyway." He gestured vaguely at her pregnant belly, reducing her entire existence to a single biological function, completely unaware that the woman before him had negotiated international contracts worth billions, had built distribution networks across 6 continents, had created jobs for over 50,000 employees worldwide. But Victoria had learned long ago that some people only see what they expect to see, their assumptions blinding them to reality, even when truth stands directly in front of them, wearing a flower maternity dress and tear-stained makeup. The baby shower guests began to murmur among themselves, the shock wearing off enough for anger and indignation to surface. Victoria's sister, Rebecca, moved through the crowd toward James with the fury of a protective sibling ready to defend her family. "You absolute piece of," Rebecca started, but Victoria raised her hand again, stopping her sister mid-sentence with a gesture that carried unexpected authority. The kind of command that comes from years of running boardrooms and making decisions that affect millions of people. "It's okay, Rebecca," Victoria said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears still streaming down her face. Each word carefully controlled, even though her heart was breaking into pieces she wasn't sure could ever be reassembled. "James has made his choice, And I won't beg someone to stay who clearly wants to leave. She looked directly at her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, and something in her gaze made him shift uncomfortably, though he couldn't have explained why if someone had asked him. What James didn't know, what his arrogance and his mistress's whispered encouragements had prevented him from ever discovering, was that Victoria had spent the last 6 months watching him prepare for the Apex Global Industries deal with a mixture of pride and growing heartbreak. She'd listened to him practice his presentations at dinner, had heard him take phone calls with her company's representatives while she pretended to read in the next room, had watched him grow more distant and cold as success seemed to move closer within his reach. 3 months ago, when she'd first suspected his affair with Natasha, Victoria had sat in her private office at Apex Global Headquarters, the top-floor corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and made a decision that would test both her husband's character and her own strength. She'd instructed her legal team to move forward with James's deal, to give him everything he wanted professionally, to let him believe he'd earned this triumph through his own merit and skill, all while knowing that the final signature required would be hers, that the mysterious CEO he'd never met was the wife he was preparing to discard. Victoria's assistant and closest confidant, Michael Torres, had argued against this approach, had warned her that giving James the deal would only embolden him, would make the eventual betrayal cut even deeper when it inevitably came. If you suspect he's cheating, Victoria, why reward him with the contract of his career? Michael had asked, his loyalty to her making him protective in ways that went beyond their professional relationship. But Victoria had shaken her head, her hand already resting on the baby bump that was just beginning to show at 3 months pregnant, her eyes distant with the pain that came from loving someone who might not love her back. "Because I need to know, Michael," she'd said softly, her voice carrying the weight of someone preparing for heartbreak. "I need to know if James loves me or if he loves what I can do for his career. And the only way to find that out is to give him everything professionally while being nothing but his pregnant wife personally." Now, standing in this baby shower venue with divorce papers in her hands and her husband's mistress laughing at her tears, Victoria had her answer, clear, devastating, and absolutely undeniable. James had chosen ambition over love, had chosen a woman who stroked his ego over a wife who'd built him opportunities he didn't even recognize, had chosen to humiliate her publicly rather than have a private conversation like adults who'd once promised forever to each other. The knowledge settled into her bones with a finality that felt like mourning. But beneath the grief, something else was stirring, a cold, calculated determination that had built a trillion-dollar empire from nothing and wouldn't hesitate to protect itself when threatened. Tomorrow morning's meeting would reveal everything, would strip away every illusion James had constructed about his own importance and Natasha's supposed victory, would demonstrate with brutal clarity that actions always carry consequences, even when people are too arrogant to see them coming. Victoria carefully placed the divorce papers back in the envelope, her movements deliberate and controlled, then looked at James with an expression that held secrets he couldn't begin to comprehend. "I'll sign these," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent room with unexpected strength. "And tomorrow, after your big meeting, we'll talk about the settlement." James nodded, relief flooding his features, as if he'd expected more resistance, more drama, more of the emotional mess he'd been bracing himself to handle. James Hayes adjusted his tie for the 3rd time in the elevator, ascending to the 47th floor of the Apex Global Industries headquarters building. His reflection in the polished metal doors showed a man who'd barely slept but was running on pure adrenaline and ambition. Natasha stood beside him, her hand possessively on his arm. Wearing a designer suit she'd charged to the credit card he'd given her last month, with promises that today's deal would make such expenses meaningless in the grand scheme of his upcoming wealth. "You're going to be incredible in there," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear, her confidence in him absolute, because she'd never seen him as anything other than the successful executive he presented to the world. "Once you sign this $10.5 billion deal, every company in the industry will be fighting for your attention, and that pathetic woman crying at her baby shower yesterday will realize exactly what she lost." The words should have made him feel powerful, validated, vindicated in his decision to divorce Victoria. But something nagged at the edges of his consciousness, a detail he couldn't quite place about yesterday's confrontation. Something in his wife's eyes when she'd agreed to sign the papers that hadn't looked like defeat despite her tears. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that screamed wealth and power. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, abstract art that probably cost more than most people's houses, and a receptionist whose professional smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she greeted them. "Mr. Hayes, welcome to Apex Global Industries," she said, her tone perfectly neutral, neither warm nor cold, giving away absolutely nothing about what awaited him beyond the massive frosted glass doors leading to the executive conference room. "The CEO will see you shortly, but she's requested that you wait in the lobby for just a few minutes while she concludes another meeting." James nodded, trying to appear calm and collected, even though his heart was racing with anticipation. This moment represented the culmination of 6 months of negotiations, presentations, revisions, and strategic positioning that had consumed his every waking thought. Natasha squeezed his hand, her eyes scanning the luxury surrounding them with barely concealed greed, already imagining herself belonging in spaces like this, already planning the life she'd build on the foundation of his success. What James didn't know, what Natasha couldn't have guessed, was that behind those frosted glass doors, Victoria sat at the head of a 30-foot conference table, her pregnancy barely noticeable under the tailored Armani suit she wore for board meetings and contract signings. Michael Torres stood beside her, tablet in hand, displaying the divorce papers James had served yesterday alongside the $10.5 billion contract that required only her signature to finalize. 2 documents representing a collision of personal devastation and professional power that would reshape multiple lives in the next 15 minutes. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Victoria?" Michael asked quietly, his concern for her evident in the way his usually professional demeanor softened with genuine worry. "Once we bring him in here, once he sees you sitting in that chair, there's no going back from what happens next." Victoria nodded slowly, her hand resting on her belly, where her baby, James's baby, though he'd made it clear yesterday that even impending fatherhood wasn't enough to keep him committed, kicked gently as if offering support for what was about to unfold. "He made his choice when he handed me divorce papers at my own baby's shower, Michael," Victoria said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of pain that 6 months of CO training couldn't completely mask. "He made his choice when he brought his mistress to humiliate me in front of my family and friends, when he reduced my worth to picking out nursery colors, when he decided that his ambition mattered more than our vows or our child." She paused, looking at the divorce papers on the screen, remembering the weight of that envelope in her trembling hands, the sound of Natasha's cruel laughter, the way James had looked at her like she was an obstacle he'd finally found a way around. But what he doesn't understand yet, what neither of them understand, is that I gave him every opportunity to choose differently, and the consequences of his choices aren't my responsibility anymore. Michael nodded, understanding in his eyes, then tapped his tablet to signal the receptionist that they were ready, setting in motion a revelation that would destroy the carefully constructed reality James and Natasha had been living in since yesterday's confrontation. The frosted glass doors opened, and James walked into the conference room with Natasha half a step behind him, both of them expecting to see corporate executives in expensive suits, lawyers with briefcases, perhaps a few board members observing this significant transaction. What they saw instead made James stop so abruptly that Natasha bumped into him, her annoyed exclamation dying in her throat when she followed his gaze to the woman sitting at the head of the table. Victoria met her husband's eyes calmly, watching the confusion bloom across his features, seeing the exact moment recognition hit him like a physical blow, observing as his brain scrambled to make sense of his pregnant wife. The woman he'd divorced yesterday, the woman whose tears Natasha had laughed at, sitting in the CEO's chair of the company that controlled his entire professional future. "Hello, James," Victoria said quietly, her voice professional and controlled, the same tone she used when addressing shareholders and international partners. "Thank you for coming to finalize the Apex Global Industries contract. Please sit down." The color drained from James's face as understanding crashed over him in waves. Each revelation more devastating than the last. Each piece of information he'd never bothered to learn about his own wife, now combining into a picture that shattered everything he'd believed about his life, his success, and his choices. Natasha stood frozen beside him, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the first hints of genuine fear as she began to comprehend that the woman she'd mocked yesterday wasn't just some housewife being discarded, but rather the trillionaire CEO who controlled access to the corporate world Natasha had been so desperate to enter through James's coattails. I don't understand," James stammered, his usual confident demeanor completely demolished, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the back of the leather chair Victoria had indicated. You're the CEO. You're Victoria Chun, but that's your maiden name, I thought." His voice trailed off as more pieces fell into place. Her mysterious hobbies that kept her busy during the day, the way she always seemed to understand his business discussions better than he'd expected, the fact that she'd never seemed particularly impressed by his career achievements, even when he'd expected admiration and praise. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her hands folded across her pregnant belly, watching her husband's world crumble with an expression that held more sadness than satisfaction, more grief than triumph. "Yes, James, I'm Victoria Chun, founder and CEO of Apex Global Industries," she confirmed, each word landing with the weight of truth that could no longer be denied or explained away. "I built this company from nothing 7 years ago, 2 years before we met, and I've been running it throughout our entire marriage while you assumed I was just staying home planning dinner parties and picking out curtains." She paused, letting that information settle, watching Natasha's face pale as the implications became clear. Every insult she'd thrown at Victoria yesterday, every mocking comment about her lack of ambition and contribution, had been directed at someone who'd achieved more than Natasha would likely accomplish in 10 lifetimes. "The $10.5 billion deal you've been negotiating for 6 months? That's my company, my contract, and my decision whether or not to sign it. Which means your entire career, your reputation, and your future are sitting in my hands right now. Exactly where you put them when you served me divorce papers yesterday." James collapsed into the chair, his legs no longer able to support him as the full magnitude of his catastrophic mistake became undeniable, his entire worldview shattering like glass dropped from a great height. Natasha remained standing, her face cycling through emotions so rapidly that she looked almost cartoonish, shock bleeding into panic, panic morphing into desperate calculation, and calculation crumbling into the stark realization that she'd hitched her wagon to a man who'd just destroyed himself spectacularly. "Victoria, please, let me explain," James began, his voice cracking with desperation that sounded nothing like the confident executive who'd handed her divorce papers 24 hours ago. "I didn't know. I mean, you never told me. Why didn't you tell me?" The question revealed everything wrong with his character in a single sentence. Even now, facing the consequences of his betrayal, his first instinct was to blame her for his ignorance rather than take responsibility for never bothering to truly know the woman he'd married, never asking about her life beyond how it affected his comfort, never seeing her as a complete person separate from her role as his wife. Victoria's expression didn't change, her composure absolute, despite the baby kicking inside her as if responding to the tension saturating the conference room air. "I didn't tell you because I wanted to know if you love me for myself, James. Not for what I could do for your career," she said, each word measured and deliberate, stripped of the emotion that had characterized yesterday's tears, but somehow cutting deeper because of that very absence of feeling. "I wanted to believe that the man I married valued me as a partner, respected me as a person, and would stand by me regardless of wealth or status or professional achievement." She paused, her hand resting protectively on her belly, and something in that gesture made James flinch as he realized he'd abandoned not just his wife, but his unborn child, for a woman who was now backing toward the door like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. But instead, you served me divorce papers at my baby shower, brought your mistress to laugh at my tears, and told me my greatest accomplishment was picking out nursery colors while you prepared to sign a deal with my company, completely oblivious to the fact that your success was never yours alone. It was something I'd been building for you all along. Natasha's voice cut through the heavy silence, shrill with panic and self-preservation instincts that had kicked in the moment she'd understood her position. I didn't know either. James never mentioned his wife ran a company. He said she just stayed home doing nothing important. The words tumbled out desperately, and Victoria noticed how quickly Natasha distanced herself from James now that his value had evaporated, how the possessive hand on his arm yesterday had become empty air between them today. If I'd known you were Victoria Chun, I never would have. I mean, this is all just a huge misunderstanding. But Victoria had built a trillion-dollar empire by reading people, by understanding motivations and character flaws, and the masks people wore to hide their true natures. And she saw through Natasha's performance with the same clarity she'd used yesterday to see through James's justifications for abandoning his family. You laughed at my tears, Natasha, Victoria said quietly, her voice colder than ice despite its softness. You mocked a pregnant woman at her baby shower, called her accomplishments meaningless, and celebrated taking her husband. Not because you didn't know who I was, but because you thought I was powerless to stop you. Michael Torres stepped forward then, placing a revised contract on the table in front of James. Not the $10.5 billion deal he'd spent 6 months pursuing, but something entirely different, something that made his face go even whiter as he scanned the opening paragraphs. What is this? James whispered, though he clearly understood exactly what he was reading, the legal language spelling out his professional destruction in precise, unambiguous terms. This is the consequence of your choices, Victoria answered, her tone businesslike and final. The voice of a CEO making a decision that would affect thousands of lives, but was nonetheless necessary for the integrity of her company. Apex Global Industries will not be moving forward with the original contract. And furthermore, we're withdrawing all partnerships with your firm effective immediately. Partnerships worth approximately $800 million annually that your company built their entire business model around. She watched the information penetrate his consciousness, saw him calculate the ripple effects this would create, understood the moment he realized his firm would collapse without Apex Global's business, and that he would be blamed entirely for losing the relationship through whatever vague explanation his superiors would eventually extract from this disaster. But it's not just your career that's over, James, Victoria continued, her voice carrying the weight of justice that had been building since yesterday's humiliation. You see, when you served me divorce papers, you inadvertently triggered prenuptial agreement clauses that you clearly never read carefully. Clauses that were designed to protect my company and my assets in exactly this scenario. Michael pulled up documents on the conference room screen, and James stared at his own signature on agreements he'd signed 5 years ago without a second thought, so confident in his own importance that he'd never imagined a situation where his wife would have anything worth protecting from him. According to our prenuptial agreement, infidelity resulting in divorce before our 5th anniversary, which is next month, in case you'd forgotten, means you leave the marriage with exactly what you brought into it, which was approximately $47,000 in savings and a lease Mercedes you're 3 months behind on payments for. The numbers appeared on screen, and Natasha made a small sound of distress as she calculated her own future evaporating alongside James's. Her dreams of luxury and status built entirely on foundations that had just crumbled into dust. Victoria stood slowly, her pregnant form dignified despite the circumstances, and walked around the conference table until she stood directly in front of the man she'd loved enough to marry, trusted enough to build a life with, believed in enough to have a baby with. You called me disposable yesterday, James. Said I contributed nothing to your life and held you back from the success you deserved, she said softly. And for the first time since they'd entered the conference room, real emotion crept into her voice. Not anger or vindication, but profound sadness for what could have been if he'd chosen differently. But the truth is, I gave you everything, My love, my trust, my loyalty, and opportunities you were too blind to recognize as gifts rather than achievements you'd earned through your own merit. She placed a single piece of paper on the table in front of him, her signature already adorning the divorce papers he drafted, her agreement to end their marriage now formalized and legally binding. "So here's what happens next," Victoria said, her voice steady and clear. "You'll return to your firm and explain how you've lost the biggest client in their portfolio. You'll face whatever professional consequences follow from that explanation, and you'll discover exactly how far your career can go without standing on foundations I built for you." James reached for her hand, desperation making him forget everything except the need to somehow undo what couldn't be undone, to rewind time and make different choices that his character had never actually been capable of making. "Victoria, please. I made a mistake. I'll do anything." But she stepped back, placing distance between them that represented far more than physical space. Her expression sad but resolute in ways that told him she'd already grieved this relationship and moved beyond it, even while he was still scrambling to understand what he'd lost. "The only mistake was mine, James. I mistook your ambition for drive, your confidence for strength, and your charm for character," Victoria said, her hand resting on her belly where their child grew. A baby who would know their father's name, but would be raised with values he'd never demonstrated. "But I'm a quick learner, and I won't make the same mistake twice." She turned to Michael, nodding once, and he began ushering James and Natasha toward the door, their protests and pleas falling on ears that had heard enough lies to last a lifetime. As the conference room doors closed behind them, Victoria returned to her chair and sat down heavily, the composure finally cracking as tears she'd been holding back began to fall. Not tears of weakness or defeat, but the necessary grief of letting go of dreams that had died long before yesterday's baby shower. Her phone buzzed with messages from her sister Rebecca, her mother, friends who'd witnessed yesterday's humiliation and wanted to check on her. She smiled slightly through her tears, realizing that while she'd lost a husband who'd never truly valued her, she still had family who loved her, a company she'd built with her own hands and vision, and a child on the way who would be raised to understand that integrity mattered more than status, that character outweighed wealth, and that true power came from knowing your own worth rather than seeking validation from people too small-minded to recognize it. The $10.5 billion deal that would have made James a legend would instead become a cautionary tale told in business schools about the catastrophic cost of betraying someone without understanding who they really were. And somewhere in that poetic justice, Victoria found the strength to begin healing from wounds that would scar but wouldn't define her. She built an empire once from nothing. Now she would build a life for herself and her child, founded on the lessons learned from loving the wrong person but having the courage to walk away when respect was lost. 3 months later, Victoria would welcome a healthy baby girl into the world, surrounded by family who celebrated her strength. And while James would struggle to rebuild a career he destroyed through arrogance, Victoria would continue leading Apex Global Industries to even greater heights, proving once and for all that quiet strength always surpasses loud confidence, and that treating everyone with dignity isn't just right, it's essential. Glowing Star, the end glowing star. What did you think of Victoria's story? What lessons did you take from this tale of betrayal and justice? If you were in Victoria's position, what would you have done differently? Speech Balloon, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Thumbs up like this video if you believe in karma and justice. Bell subscribe for more powerful educational stories that entertain while teaching valuable life lessons. Loudspeaker, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, respect matters regardless of someone's perceived status. Arrogance blinds us to reality, and integrity always outlasts ambition. Quiet strength often surpasses loud confidence, and treating everyone with dignity isn't just right, it's essential. See you in the next story.